What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. In today's video, I'm going to be analyzing Dr. Kipp Davis's reaction to people, including Carrier himself, pointing out that Kipp is skipping some footnotes in his analysis of On the Historicity of Jesus. Dr. Kipp is also disregarding some very important citations that he should pay attention to. If you want to fuck around and find out how Dr. Kipp Davis reacts to expert conclusions that differ from his own, then please stay tuned.
Wait! You may be wondering why the red suit. Well, that's so bad guys can't see me bleed. This guy's got the right idea. He wore the brown pants.
So, Dr. Kipp's reaction to the expert sources that are cited in OHJ is less than ideal. In On the Historicity of Jesus, Dr. Carrier cites Daniel Boyarin and Martin Hengel in order to prove his point about a pre-Christian suffering and dying Messiah. Recently, Dr. Carrier has also started to cite Jason Staples, Israel Knoll, Michael Wise, and David Mitchell that also come to the same conclusion. Staples himself cites 4 other scholars that have also come to this conclusion. You know what? Let's just run a whole list of expert scholars that agree with the idea of a pre-Christian suffering and dying Messiah.
Cause I don't give a fuck what you say. Yeah, I'ma do shit my way. So you can go kick rocks, I'ma stack bricks up, build what I want to make.
Yo, I got a lot of shit to say, so I'ma do this every day. I'll be writing things until I'm fucking buried in my grave. 6 feet deep under, but my body won't decay. Cause my messages are timeless, so they'll put them on display. Oh yeah, I rap with a certainty, I have a sense of urgency. A message for eternity, for everyone internally. I had some people burning me, but now they fucking learn to see I ain't the one to fuck with. Now they looking nervously, and I don't really care what you think of me respectfully. You can kick rocks if you think you're fucking better, see. I will outwork you, turn you to an enemy. Hurt you so
needless to say, there's considerable support for element 5. Now, something to keep in mind as we progress through this analysis is that Dr. Kipp has admitted that he understands that Dr. Carrier doesn't have any translation literacy in Hebrew and doesn't have the expertise necessary in order to interpret Old Testament Hebrew texts.
I think it's important to note at the outset that Carrier clearly knows neither Hebrew nor Aramaic, and this is significant because these are the source languages of all of these texts. It also seems obvious to me that he doesn't really have a good understanding of most of the Jewish texts that he attempts to interpret and doesn't really have a good sense of how Jewish scripture exegesis even works.
So, I know when I discuss a topic outside my area of expertise, I generally will consult the experts on that topic. What do the experts say? What do the critics of these experts say? And how do the original experts respond to the criticism? This is exactly what Carrier does in On the Historicity of Jesus. In Carrier's citations, he mentions the experts, that would be Daniel Boyarin and Martin Hengel, on the topic of a pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah. So Carrier, knowing his limitations, provides a summary of the experts on this topic. Thus, that's why Carrier's summaries can map directly to the sources that he cited, because he's just summarizing the experts on this topic. They know Hebrew, Aramaic, and the Jewish text and culture. Now, I'm perfectly fine with Dr. Kipp having an issue with the idea of a pre-Christian suffering and dying Messiah. But if he has a problem with the position that Dr. Carrier is summarizing, then he has to deal with the cited experts, instead of solely focusing on Carrier. As you'll see, Dr. Kipp doesn't do that. So how exactly did Dr. Kipp react to these citations? Starting from the beginning, Dr. Kipp originally just dismissed all these citations out of hand. My claim is that the rabbis in B Sanhedrin 98b have no interest in the, quote, suffering servant, end quote, beyond this one verse. Moreover, they do not cite Isaiah 53 at all in B Sanhedrin 93b. Carrier's reading of these Talmudium is demonstrably incorrect. No citation of other sources helps to correct that error. Besides, I have come to discover that half of the time Carrier's cited secondary sources do not align at all with the point he is attempting to make. He regularly, shamelessly pads his bibliography. Now, I feel like it's pretty obvious that people were not satisfied with Dr. Kipp just casually dismissing all of the experts that were cited. And it is certainly sad to see a scholar disregard citations that are important to the point being made. Ideally, what should have happened was Dr. Kipp providing an explanation as to why Daniel Boyarin or Martin Hengel were wrong about their conclusions, or why Dr. Carrier's summary doesn't represent what Daniel Boyarin or Martin Hengel actually concluded. Again, this is all because Dr. Carrier is summarizing what the experts are saying. Now, it should be rather easy for Dr. Kipp to explain why Carrier is not accurately summarizing Daniel Boyarin or Martin Hengel. He could easily pull a quote out from either source that thoroughly refutes the point that Dr. Carrier's Element 5 is making. And I have to say that Dr. Kipp's input on these expert conclusions would be incredibly helpful in this situation. Sadly, though, we don't ever get that. What we get is Dr. Kipp continuing to come up with reasons or excuses as to why he's not checking Carrier's cited sources, including there's just too many sources to check. Yeah, it's hard to do because Carrier cites so much secondary literature, and there is no way anyone can check it all. And even though he will sometimes quote accurately selections from these texts, often they are divorced from their larger contexts. I do find it telling, though, that in response to a video series about how he reads and interprets primary texts, his complaints have yet to actually discuss the texts themselves. He sticks to complaints of methodology and statements from secondary sources, and I think this is deliberate. He doesn't want to get into a discussion about the texts because he doesn't know them. So, first of all, even Dr. Kipp has admitted that Dr. Carrier doesn't have translation competency in Hebrew. Why would Dr. Kipp expect Carrier to analyze text he can't translate or interpret? So why wouldn't Dr. Kipp take this little bit of a hint about it being out of Carrier's area of expertise and recognize that Carrier is relying on experts in the field? Maybe it's because Dr. Kipp would rather attack Carrier than attack the well-respected scholars in his own field. And I have to say, it would be an incredibly bad look for Dr. Kipp to chastise Daniel Boyarin or Martin Hengel the way that he's been chastising Dr. Carrier. I'm sure he wouldn't want to be seen calling either of them inept or uneducated. Next, there are a lot of secondary sources that are cited in Dr. Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus. But for the topics that Kipp has covered, Dr. Carrier's only cited 2 sources, besides citing his previous work and source material. And Dr. Kipp doesn't have to look too hard to find these sources in the material either. Boyarin is mentioned in the first footnote of Element 5, footnote 29. Reading this citation would have clued you into the Talmud references, because that's how Daniel Boyarin connects Isaiah 53 to this pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah. Then, Hengel is mentioned in footnote 38 of Element 5, and is mentioned in light of not being convinced by 11Q13, which is one of the subjects of Kipp's second video, mentioning a suffering and dying Messiah. The point is that even if you don't accept 11Q13 and all of the experts that argue that point, you can still see Martin Hengel, who is connecting Isaiah 53 to this pre-Christian suffering and dying Messiah idea. This isn't hard. I'm an engineer, and so not an academic per se, but at least I'm competent enough to be able to follow citations and understand why someone is citing a particular expert opinion.
Lilu Dallas Multipass. Yeah.
Multipass.
Multipass. You know this multipass.
I can also plainly read the text that's given and see how it supports Carrier's point. I feel like this is a minimal requirement for analyzing any kind of scholarly work. And it's definitely not that these sources are just padding the bibliography or don't support Carrier's statements, as Kipp, without verifying, has directly stated. It's just that verifying 2 sources is apparently too much work for Dr. Kipp. That just means that he ends up pulling shit out of his ass, and it's all because he doesn't know the material. It seems to me that if you're a scholar in this precise area and you've encountered somebody that doesn't have the requisite expertise in order to provide a source analysis of the text, then you should probably check out the experts that person is citing instead of belaboring some point that this person doesn't have the expertise in order to analyze the text that person never tries to analyze. One of Kipp's points in all of this analysis is that Carrier doesn't analyze the source text. But why would he expect that out of Carrier when he's already admitted that Carrier doesn't have the requisite expertise in order to analyze the text? It seems like a weird thing to me. So what exactly could Carrier be doing wrong here? From what I can tell, he's not doing anything wrong. Carrier is doing exactly what somebody should do if a topic is outside their area of expertise. Now, Kipp has responded to some of these citations in an interview he did, but to say that it was less than satisfying would be an overstatement.
So, Richard mentioned a couple of sources, Martin Hengel and Daniel Boyarin. So I thought one of the things I think is important to point out is because this is some of the pushback that I have gotten, is that people seem to think I'm suggesting that Isaiah 53 isn't messianic, and that's not the point. If I made this point poorly, I apologize for that, but that's not the point that I was trying to make. And one of the problems here is this term, messianic. What do we mean by that? What did it mean to the people who read these texts in the 1st century BC, in the 1st century CE? Because I think that's really where some of the disconnect is. Like this notion that, yes, I will concede that there's a possibility. And well, I mean, we have the New Testament, which seems to make use of Isaiah 53 as a messianic text in the 1st century CE, right? So clearly somebody was making this connection. But what did they mean by that? And just because they saw it connected to Jesus, does this mean that every single Jewish person understood these texts, or even the majority of Jewish people understood these texts in similar ways? So one of the things within I mentioned earlier this book by Alex Jason called Mediating the Divine, where he does like a deep dive on the idea of prophecy within the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular. And I think one of the very important discoveries that he makes, and I particularly like this idea from within his book, is that this term, Mashiach, which means anointed one, which comes to mean Messiah, within the Dead Sea Scrolls, far and away, most of the time, this is with reference to prophets. This is just a way you talk about prophets. So it's interesting when you read the scrolls because you start seeing Mashiachim, the plural form, you start seeing messiahs popping up all over the place.
Well, Carrier has already clarified what he means by messianic.
I shall mean by Messiah, the Hebrew word of which Christ is a translation, any man, in fact, myth, or prophecy who is A, anointed by the Hebrew God, to B, play a part in God's plan to liberate his chosen people from their oppressors, and C, restore or institute God's true religion. Richard Carrier on the Historicity of Jesus, page 100.
Now, Dr. Kipp has discussed how he doesn't like how Carrier has defined messianic, or this idea of a Messiah, but he even admitted that Carrier wasn't wrong.
In the broad strokes, he's not wrong. But the primary problem here is this is not so narrowly how Jews understood the term Mashiach. Even as late as the early 2nd century, when the book of Daniel was written, he very clearly only understood this to mean the office of the ruling high priest when the term was used. And the priest figured in the text of Daniel, who is Onias III, is clearly not presented as a liberator of God's chosen people from their oppressors, and he was not a religious reformer. And I think one of the very important discoveries that he makes, and I particularly like this idea from within his book, is that this term, Mashiach, which means anointed one, which comes to mean Messiah, within the Dead Sea Scrolls, far and away, most of the time, this is with reference to prophets.
Kipp ends up changing the concept of a Messiah from Carrier's definition to this rather simplistic definition of simply a prophet. What Kipp is doing is creating an equivocation in order to build a straw man argument that nobody is arguing. And even in 2014, Dr. Carrier knew that scholars exactly like Kipp Davis would be doing this exact thing. And he's already addressed this straw man argument in a section that Kipp supposedly read.
But such a denial is accomplished only by proposing an implausibly hyper-specific definition of Messiah, then showing no such thing was previously imagined, and concluding the Jews had no prior notion of a Messiah. This is a textbook fallacy of equivocation. Start with a term defined one way, then end with the same term defined in a completely different way, often without noticing a switch has been made. To avoid this, I shall stick to my minimal definition, since I am certain anyone meeting criteria A, B, and C would have been regarded by at least some ancient Jews or Judaizers as a Messiah. Richard Carrier on the Historicity of Jesus, page 101.
Dr. Carrier's context was always focused on how the Jews creating peshers about the Savior Messiah either did or could have easily interpreted the scriptures to inform themselves about the Savior Messiah. Kipp must rip Carrier out of his original context in order to create a straw man to tear his argument down. In that interview clip, Dr. Kipp even admitted to some Jews interpreting Isaiah 53 in the exact way that Dr. Carrier has stated when Dr. Kipp mentioned the New Testament. So, Kipp seems to understand what Carrier's point is here, and to some degree, he seems to agree with Carrier's sources that Isaiah 53 was interpreted messianically. He also seems to agree with Carrier that Isaiah 53 and its suffering and dying Messiah interpretation had a significant impact on the development of Christianity. So what exactly does Kipp disagree with here? That Carrier is repeating what the experts in Kipp's own field is saying? This is a prime opportunity for Dr. Kipp to explain why Carrier's summaries of Dr. Boyarin and Martin Hengel are wrong. Instead of doing that, though, Dr. Kipp continues this crusade against Carrier's handling of the Hebrew text that Carrier never attempts to analyze, and even Kipp admits Carrier doesn't have the expertise to analyze. The fact that Kipp doesn't even try to explain why Boyarin or Hengel are wrong in their conclusions, or why Carrier is misrepresenting their conclusions, just blows my mind. Kipp seems to vaguely mention how Carrier is misrepresenting the experts. How? If Carrier is doing that, then it should be easy for you to demonstrate that he is doing that. But instead of doing that, Kipp hyper-focuses in on something he already admits Carrier can't do, but more importantly, Carrier never does. Additionally, Kipp seems to not know what Daniel Boyarin argues in his book, because Kipp continues with this.
The word itself just means anointed one, right? So when it comes to reading a lot of this literature, and understanding what's going on in it, like when we talk about Isaiah 52 and 53 as messianic texts, sure, in that people read these texts and saw elements within them which spoke to their present day or to what they understood to take place in the last days. That's what messianic means. It doesn't mean that they always, or even mostly, or ever understood the suffering servant to be, you know, the king that Yahweh was going to promote to usher in the new age.
You know, that's really weird for Kipp to say about Dr. Carrier's citation of Daniel Boyarin, especially if Kipp knew what Boyarin said, because in Boyarin's book it says this:
The suffering Messiah who atones for our sins was a familiar idea throughout the history of the Jewish religion, even long after there truly was a separation from Christianity. The idea of a suffering Messiah is present in ancient, medieval, and early modern Judaism. This fact, at the very least, calls into question the truism that the formation and acceptance of this idea by followers of Jesus constituted the necessary and absolute breaking point with the religion of Israel. The suffering Messiah is part and parcel of Jewish tradition from antiquity to modernity. Not only then is the gospel drawing on Jewish tradition, but this idea remained a Jewish one long after Christianity had indeed been separated off in late antiquity. There are also various medieval Jewish commentators, among them figures marginal to rabbinic Judaism, but hardly suspected of Christian leanings, such as the Karaite Yefet ben Ali, who clearly understand the Isaiah text and its suffering servant as about the Messiah. The early modern Kabbalist Rabbi Moshe Alshek, also a spotlessly orthodox rabbinite teacher, writes, quote, I may remark then that our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the King Messiah, and we ourselves also adhere to the same view, end quote. The intellectual giant of Spanish Jewry, Rabbi Moses ben Naaman, concedes that according to the Midrash and the rabbis of the Talmud, Isaiah 53 is entirely about the Messiah, but he dissents. Daniel Boyarin, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of the Jewish Christ, pages 82 and 83.
Boyarin reports the exact thing that Kipp says never happened. So Dr. Kipp is continuing to say that Daniel Boyarin, a premier rabbinical scholar, doesn't know the Jewish literature or language. Boyarin was the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Professor of Talmudic Culture and Near Eastern Studies and Rhetoric at UC Berkeley. He is a rock star in the field of Talmudic studies, but Kipp calls him inept, and his understanding of Talmudic literature abysmal. Now, I don't think that Boyarin's prestige proves that everything he says is correct or anything. I'm simply putting Kipp's claim of ineptitude into context of who he's really talking about. Now, Kipp could explain why Boyarin is wrong or was proved wrong. Of course, Kipp has also said this. So, fun fact, since you appear firmly entrenched inside Carrier's blogosphere, you are probably completely unaware of this, but actual scholars in the fields of research on which his tripe book has touched are of virtually the same mind about most of the things I have covered in these videos. The reason you are probably unaware of this is because Carrier is such an exceptionally poor reader. He continues to mount complaints that are completely beside the point of my critique, which is simply, exclusively, that Carrier's handling and representation of the early Jewish literature is abysmal. I don't care about how this does or does not affect his larger argument. I care about the text and what they have to say. And I am keen to steer people in the right direction when they are misled by charlatans like Carrier about their contents and implications for understanding first century Roman Palestine. Kipp claiming that all of the scholars have virtually a single mind on this idea, meaning the position that he's arguing for, is refuted not only by the Boyarin and Hengel citations, but also this entire list of scholars.
Cause I don't give a fuck what you say. Yeah, I'ma do shit my way. So you can go kick rocks, I'ma stack bricks up, build what I want to make.
Yo, I got a lot of shit to say, so I'ma do this every day. I'll be writing things until I'm fucking buried in my grave. 6 feet deep under, but my body won't decay. Cause my messages are timeless, so they'll put them on display. Oh yeah, I rap with the certainty I A message for eternity for everyone internally. I had some people burning me, but now they fucking learn to see I ain't the one to fuck with. Now they looking nervously, and I don't really care what you think of me respectfully. You can kick rocks if you think you're fucking better. See, I will outwork you, turn you to an enemy. Hurt you so bad.
And I don't know if you noticed this, but in that comment, Dr. Kipp gives another reason as to why he has yet to check any of the citations concerning this point. So now it's, there's too many sources to check, and Carrier just simply can't read good. I feel like it doesn't take a Talmudic scholar in order to read what Boyarin wrote in his book, because Boyarin was pretty clear that the notion of this suffering and dying Messiah only developing after Jesus supposedly died is an antiquated idea, and that it's been known in the field for some time now that the suffering and dying Messiah is actually a pre-Christian Jewish idea. After Kipp's dismissal of the sources and excuses as to why he's not checking the sources, he does what any good scholar would do. He devolves into mockery about citing experts. But Richard once read a book by Daniel Boyarin. Boyarin is the premier scholar to cite about the Talmud. Let me make sure that my math is correct here. Boyarin is the premier scholar to cite on the Talmud. Carrier doesn't have the necessary expertise in order to translate and interpret the Talmud or Hebrew Jewish texts. And this should result in what everybody should do, and that's consulting the experts. Coincidentally, this is why I don't fault anyone for not being a mythicist due to the consensus. And you might be wondering, well, why doesn't Carrier do this for the topic of Jesus' historicity altogether? Well, you see, Carrier is an expert in the time and culture in which Christianity arose. He's doing exactly what Kipp should be doing but refuses to do, and that's challenging the experts in the field by providing counter arguments and counter evidence that proves that their conclusions are wrong. I think it's pretty evident who the responsible scholar is in this situation. I mean, what kind of scholar disparages the idea of citing a premier Talmudic scholar on the topic of the Talmud? Apparently, the final authority on this topic is Kipp Davis, according to Kipp Davis and approved by Kipp Davis. This statement also fails to capture the fact that it wasn't just Boyarin, it was also Martin Hengel. Since the writing of On the Historicity of Jesus' Element 5, the list of scholars that support the conclusion of Element 5 has grown by 13 scholars, which all brings me to my next point. The Jason Staples citation. Aside from Boyarin and Hengel, Carrier now also cites Jason Staples for proof of a pre-Christian suffering and dying Messiah. Now, the Staples reference isn't meant to substantiate the Talmud claims, but Staples provides references that establish the Isaiah 53 suffering and dying Messiah interpretation as a pre-Christian Jewish idea. And here is how Kipp initially addressed the reference.
I wanted to point out, Richard in the chat mentioned Jason Staples, who talks about this. And I think about the pre-Christian ideas about the suffering servant. And I think, again, it's important to point out a lot of these non-scroll scholars who promote this idea are depending on the way certain scholars are reading the scrolls. So, and again, like I'm going to tell you, among scroll scholars, this is pretty conjectural. It's far from settled. There are plenty of scroll scholars who deny that there is any suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism. But I also wanted to point out that he mentions that Staples cites William Brownlee, the servant of the Lord in the Qumran Scrolls, and William Brownlee was my Dr. Fodder, George J. Brooks' Dr. Fodder. So he's like my Dr. Gross Fodder. Oh, so my doctor, George Brooke was my PhD supervisor at the University of Manchester, and William Brownlee was George Brooks' PhD supervisor back at Claremont Grad School in the 1980s. So sorry, I just had to say that.
I'd say that you sound like an infomercial, but not a good one, like Slap Chop, more shake weighty.
Now, Dr. Kipp has a prime opportunity to cite all of these Dead Sea Scholars that agree with his point, but he doesn't. It would have been a really good opportunity for him to stack the deck against Carrier. I mean, he doesn't have to do a detailed analysis of all of the scholars, but he could at least provide like the last names of these people. This just amounts to a bluff to me. Like, I feel like Dr. Kipp is just bluffing about the amount of Dead Sea Scrolls that agree with him. Now, that's not to say that there couldn't be a bunch of Dead Sea Scroll scholars that agree with Kipp, and Kipp just so happens to be part of that group. But Kipp is mentioning this as if to say the untold amount of scholars on his side trump whatever citations Carrier could ever come up with. Again, this just seems like a bluff. It's also a little weird that Dr. Kipp brings up the fact that George Brooke was his PhD supervisor, considering Joseph Angel's mention of Brooke in Jesus and the priestly tradition.
The trajectory of this figure's experience, his universal significance, the association of his mission with the removal of darkness, ridicule and abuse, perhaps violent suffering, even death, and positive results for others, appears to be modeled on that of Isaiah's servant. This is corroborated by extensive linguistic and thematic links with the servant songs. For impressive lists of further connections, see Puish, Fragments, and Brooke, Apocryphon of Levi. Several scholars have thus seen evidence in 4Q 541 for the notion of a suffering Messiah in pre-Christian Judaism. See Gene Starkey. He is followed by both Puish and Brooke. Of course, this view is not without its detractors. See especially John J. Collins, The Scepter and the Star, 2nd edition, pages 142 through 145.
Angel is citing Kipp's PhD supervisor in support of the pre-Christian Jewish suffering and dying Messiah concept, using a completely different scroll than we've already discussed. Dr. Kipp is also claiming that Staples uses speculative information in order to support his statement, even though Staples cites a scholar that is part of Kipp's academic background. So obviously Kipp must know what both Staples and Brownlee have both said, right? Nope, I don't have the book, and the reason I don't mention this point in the video is because the video is about Richard's handling of Jewish literature. Where he cites Staples, I see no explanation for how that rehabilitates his numerous and substantial errors in reading the texts. I feel like if you're not going to put forth the effort to check the citations on the primary scholarly work that you're analyzing, then you're probably not going to check the citations of another source that's been quoted and then dive into the citations that that person does. Like, I feel like that's definitely way too much work for a scholar like Kipp at this point. And the fact that Dr. Kipp doesn't mention the 3 other scholars that Staples references in order to support his position and his statement shows that he hasn't even glanced at the Staples footnote, like the actual footnote. But more importantly, though, Kipp seems to continue his trend of being a good example of somebody that doesn't understand what is in On the Historicity of Jesus, even though they seem to have read it. This is because Staples is a fairly recent publication, and it didn't exist in 2014 when On the Historicity of Jesus was written. So when Kipp states that he didn't cover the Staples reference in his video, it's because in On the Historicity of Jesus, the Staples reference isn't there. Yet Kipp seems to indicate that he thinks that it is there. So just to recap what we've gone over so far, Kipp doesn't have Staples' book, he hasn't read the footnote, he refuses to do the legwork himself, and he doesn't even seem to grasp what is in the book that he's critiquing. What is Kipp doing?
Wait a minute.
Get down!
I think he's trying to say something to me.
It's definitely not scholarly work. Kipp ended up elaborating a little bit more about the Staples reference on Twix. That's Twitter after it got renamed, by the way. First, Kipp asserts that there is no evidence for pre-Christian Jews to interpret a suffering and dying Messiah. Is it possible that some early Jews interpreted it that way? That is different from saying Carrier agrees with the possible pesher. No, not at all. Carrier's suggestion about how some imaginary early Jews could have interpreted these texts is utterly vacuous. There is no evidence for it and is completely bonkers. And we absolutely do not agree about how most of these texts should be, quote, interpreted, end quote. But when pressed directly with the Staples citation, which this is what it says.
The oft-repeated dictum that there is no evidence for the concept of a suffering and dying anointed one or of a messianic interpretation of the suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism is therefore mistaken. Jason A. Staples, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, page 180.
He first, of course, asked people to do the work for him. So why does Staples say this? Then he quickly backtracks his statement. No, I am not disagreeing with Staples insofar as there is some evidence for a suffering or dying messianic figure in early Judaism. But, importantly, the evidence is quite vague, and it is more frequently read through post-Christian eyes to project this figure as something else. Coincidentally, Staples' sentiment is echoed by Daniel Boyarin.
It has been generally assumed by modern folks that Jews have always given the passage a metaphorical reading, understanding the suffering servant to refer to the people of Israel, and that it was the Christians who changed and distorted its meaning to make it refer to Jesus. Quite to the contrary. We now know that many Jewish authorities, maybe even most until nearly the modern period, have read Isaiah 53 as being about the Messiah. Until the last few centuries, the allegorical reading was a minority position. Daniel Boyarin, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of the Jewish Christ, pages 82 and 83.
Both scholars are making the point that this idea predates Christianity. This makes Kipp's statement that he doesn't disagree with them utterly false. In Kipp's final video of his analysis series, he does show himself checking one of the citations in Carrier's book.
So something I've noticed in the book and in Carrier's blog posts, Carrier continues even in his responses to me to neglect actual quotations of texts or scholarly works in favor of his own summaries or even just mere references. Now, one of the first things that I learned in grad school was to accurately and carefully restate the arguments and ideas forwarded by my conversation partners, those who I agreed with and those whom I was challenging. But Carrier has this consistent habit of neglecting to do this altogether. There are multiple instances in just this small section from chapter 4 where he provides bibliographic support for an idea, but the article or the book reference does not at all align with the point he's making. There's an example of this in his discussion of 11Q13. My friend, Marty Abegg, who is a brilliant philologist and an expert in Hebrew syntax, wrote an article in 1994 titled Messianic Hope in 4Q285. And Carrier cited this article, which supposedly supports his assertion of a more specific notion of a dying Messiah in 11Q13. Here is the only thing Marty says about that text in his article. Given the concentration both before and after line 18 on the one who brings good tidings and comforts the mournful, that Daniel 9:25 and its heralding of the coming of an anointed prince 7 weeks after the rebuilding of Jerusalem is to be preferred to the reference of his being cut off in 9:26. In fact, the entire point of Abegg's article is to argue against the idea of a messianic figure, the Nasi Ha'edah, the prince of the congregation, in 4Q285 fragment 7, being killed in the last days, and he rather convincingly suggests reading the verb in question as a hiphil with a third masculine singular pronominal suffix. He, that is, the prince of the congregation, will kill the king of the Kittim. And this entire article completely undermines the point Carrier is attempting to make.
And I'll point this out again, that the argument that Marty is making in this article is something that Carrier could follow if he knew even just basic Hebrew, but he doesn't.
All that to say, Carrier citations are not to be taken at face value, and I don't have the time or the wherewithal to check them all. I mean, who has the time for that? But in the few that I have taken the time to look at carefully, many times, they just don't even come close to saying what he implies they are saying.
This citation is on the topic of 11Q13, the Melchizedek scroll. But Kipp doesn't even understand why Carrier is referencing Abeg. What Abeg is doing in this section is discussing the debate over this scroll, and he shows a connection between 11Q13 and Daniel 25, which is part of Carrier's analysis, because if you remember, Carrier never assumes that Daniel 9:26 was mentioned in 11Q13. He only ever states the expert consensus, the expert conclusion, that it was Daniel 25 that was mentioned. And then because of the fact that Daniel 9:25 and 26 are generally interpreted to be about the same figure to the Jews that were reinterpreting the Daniel text to reveal information about the Messiah, this Abeg citation only seems to support Carrier's point. And in this particular instance, Carrier's point is 11Q13 is debated among scholars, but if it does mention a suffering and dying Messiah, this is the explanation. What we are seeing is something that I said at the very beginning of this video. In this citation that Kipp showed on his screen, we see Carrier providing direct citations that support his point in the first half of the footnote. Then Carrier goes on to cite any other secondary sources that could be important to the discussion. That would be in the See Also section, which is very grammatically and literally separated from the sources that directly support the statement that Carrier made. Fuck, this isn't rocket science. This is what a scholar should do. You have to wonder why Dr. Kipp chose to verify the Abeg source rather than one of the main sources that Carrier obviously points out as supporting his statement. Like, what about the Geza Vermesh reference? This is a text that's reasonably attainable for non-academics. I'll have an Amazon link down in the description if you would like to check it out for yourself. In that citation, Vermesh says,
"The heavenly deliverer is Melchizedek. Identical with the archangel Michael, he is the head of the sons of heaven, or gods of justice, and is referred to as Elohim and El. Here, Melchizedek is portrayed as presiding over the final judgment and condemnation of his demonic counterpart, Belial, or Satan, the prince of darkness. Elsewhere also called Melchiresha, compared to pages 391 and 570. The great act of deliverance is expected to occur on the Day of Atonement at the end of the 10th Jubilee cycle. This manuscript sheds valuable light not only on the Melchizedek figure in the Epistle to the Hebrews 7, but also on the development of the Messianic concept in the New Testament and early Christianity." Geza Vermesh, The Complete Dead Sea Scrolls, page 532.
This obviously supports Carrier's statement about how 11Q13 can be interpreted to provide a suffering and dying Messiah interpretation, considering how Daniel 9:25 and 26 are generally interpreted by the Jews that would be looking for a Messiah. One thing that gets me is that Dr. Kipp is an academic scholar that should know how these citations work. As I pointed out before, I'm an engineer, and so not an academic, but even I can understand the general structure of these footnotes. Kipp goes on to vaguely claim that several of the citations that he checked just simply didn't support Carrier's statements. But then he goes on to analyze one of the citations that's obviously separated from the primary citations, and he even misrepresented that citation. I feel like it's one of two things. Either Kipp is the one that's really inept here, or Kipp is purposefully misrepresenting Carrier in his analysis. Either way, it doesn't look good for Kipp. In conclusion, I feel like what we have seen from Kipp in this analysis is that he's not serious about analyzing OHJ or any of its single parts. He seems to only be concerned with how can he disparage Carrier instead of how can I refute the experts in my own field? He doesn't seem to want to critically analyze the expert in his own field because it's much easier to misrepresent Carrier and berate him about not analyzing the Hebrew text that even Kipp agrees Carrier doesn't have the expertise to do. It would be like berating somebody for not knowing differential equations when they've only been trained as an evolutionary biologist. It's also easier for Kipp to tear down straw man arguments than deal with real ones. We have seen Dr. Kipp either refuse to read the secondary sources, misrepresent what those secondary sources say, or failed to describe what sources are even cited in On the Historicity of Jesus. And I would also love to read about all of the expert opinions that disagree with every scholar on this list.
Cause I don't give a fuck what you say. Yeah, I'ma do shit my way. So you can go kick rocks, I'ma stack bricks up, build what I want to make.
Yo, I got a lot of shit to say, so I'ma do this every day. I'll be writing things until I'm fucking buried in my grave. 6 feet deep under, but my body won't decay. Cause my messages are timeless, so they'll put them on display. Oh yeah, I rap with a certainty, I have a sense of urgency. A message for eternity, for everyone internally. I had some people burning me, but now they fucking learn to see I ain't the one to fuck with. Now they looking nervously, and I don't really care what you think of me respectfully. You can kick rocks if you think you're fucking better, see. I will outwork you, turn you to an enemy. Hurt you so bad.
Hell, if Kipp could just pick one of the names off of that list and respond to it, explaining why they are wrong about their conclusion, that would be great. But sadly enough, we don't get that from Kipp. What we get is ridicule. What we get is dismissal. What we get is mockery. And what we get is misrepresentation. That's going to be it for this video, heathens. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about this analysis of Dr. Kipp's response to the cited experts. If you will, please, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.